It's one of our favorite places to ski.
Ah, it's so great. I stole this from my son-in-law last time I was.
What?
No,
Hi,
Alta, snowbird.
how are you?
You know, they got
Can you hear me?
almost 400 inches of snow.
Oh, wow.
I
This
can,
year.
I can remember going there for the first time and the pine trees were like this. And I said, oh, these
Hi,
pine trees are
Sheila.
so small. This- Because the rest is up.
You know,
Hi,
How are you doing?
fine, thank you.
Good to see you.
Happy to join you today.
Thank
They're
you.
very proud.
and it's all-
Not yet. How are you doing? Thank you. Thank you.
And I thought, actually, my daughter's moving to the, as we speak,
Oh, yeah.
there's a meeting there.
Oh,
Yeah.
very nice.
So, but I've had identified with everything she said,
Like growing up with.
because she was a student there.
Mm.
You said you were there in 95,
Mhm. That's when I was first there, then left, and then went back in 2005.
well, she was already. Well,
Married with 2 children.
yeah, well, I know all that about you, yeah.
We got addicted to it.
So you knew Karen and Josh, I remember talking to you about them when you first came
Yep.
here.
I remember Josh.
My daughter was very, very close with them, and
Yeah.
she's still close with Karen.
Yeah,
married-
Karen's a really nice lady.
Karen married my daughter.
Yeah, Karen's lovely.
They're very friendly. They're very close.
Nice people.
All right, go ahead. Go over
And
your.
Josh was a really nice guy.
Well, I only know him through my daughter. I never met him. Go ahead. do your thing.
All right, everybody, I would start eating your lunch if I were you. Enjoy. Ess mein Kind.
He's
Kinderlach.
his locks from the bagel.
Enjoy your lunch. Do-do-do-do-do.
I'm not allowed to touch.
You pay attention.
I
Because
know- I know not to.
no, you have to ask. Because if people rush up and start petting him, that he doesn't know, that's what. we don't want.
This dog, he sits.
He's a beautiful dog.
We sit, we sit together. So when you say stand, sometimes the dog stands.
The dog knows how to
When
dog.
he says rise, the dog gets
Please rise. Be seated.
yes, you can make that sound.
That's funny.
Not crowded here.
Perhaps as well. PC.
He's a very beautiful dog.
Yeah, well, I know.
He's a lover, and he's going to the beauty show.
Ooh.
We're our vet,
Because we use.
Jared's, Jared's.
Oh,
Jared's.
We used to that, when we're out this way. On Garrison Forest.
He likes it there. He goes in, the minute he walks into the vet's office, he gets on the skate. He should weigh me. And he won't go in the exam room until they weigh him. He's really good.
He knows better.
He's so strange.
He knows better.
He likes to go there. They take,
That's a first.
they take such good care of these animals and they are so gentle. And he's had some heavy duty stuff. He's had x-rays and all kinds of stuff. And don't have to coerce him at all to get him in the door.
Actually, our dog didn't mind going to the river.
No, I mean, even the vet.
That's right.
They didn't mind, they didn't mind.
He doesn't mind.
Makes sense.
He likes it.
What do they?
I take him there to get his toenails.
What?
Well, I understand.
Sometimes I do them, but I don't do them as close.
So we didn't, so we were afraid of the hurt.
Well, you have the quickets.
Nice to meet you.
Right.
He's very pleased.
Including myself.
All right, so you brought me lunch.
We can share.
I can share. I had my. diet bar.
Our dog?
Yeah.
There you go.
He's a good friend.
What's the dog's name?
Zeb, yeah.
Do, 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 do. Do, 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 do.
Yeah. Doesn't like you, but yeah.
What's doing?
This needs to come up a little bit. I saw it the other day. It was come up.
It's actually fine, but
No, when you see it from outside, that's all the way up. Sorry. What happened? When you used it the other day, you
Yeah.
was here at all, and saw what's left.
Ah,
You can see yourself.
yeah, unfortunately, I can see myself.
Now he's doing the same thing. He's got to get enough pieces of stuff that he sent on.
Right.
I know. We want him to bring them up.
Right. Well, there's my husband. I wait to come.
But he wakes up.
I wait.
He usually starts licking.
Boss?
We have to teach him. He doesn't wake up. He should wake me up.
Hello, my dear.
Nothing, no, I just want to ask you first if you think it's strange,
That's
because it's also on Zoom. We have kosher cookies with us, but it's also on Zoom. So is it funny that we eat that and they can't eat it?
No.
Not funny? Okay.
They
Because
just come
it's Paul's birthday.
The problem is that whoever is the diabetic should have done all the training. But he didn't know the wrong. So I did. So we also have to teach them to transfer. Yes. That's what you're. Oh.
Oh, right.
Can you open it?
So I love reading. It was a really interesting. So I was like, all righty. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Hi there on Zoom.
It's easy. I'll see it, but it's harder to try. I would love to share a video with you. Fewer people that I would love to share a cookie with than Steve.
It's true. All right, I'm going to, for the sake of the Zoomers, I'm going to, I'm sure you could all hear me without it, but I'll put it on anyway for the sake of those who can't hear me as well. And for the Zoomers, of course, I want everybody to, hello, Zoomers. Give me a wave, make sure you can hear me. Okay, everybody can hear me. So I'd like to start with a song that I'm going to play you a recording of. And I'm willing to bet you probably know this song. So hold on a second, let me play this song for you, okay? I've been singing it all day, driving myself crazy.
And us.
Yeah, and you, yes. Can you hear it at all? How many of you know this tune? I've heard this melody at least once, other than for me singing it in the office, driving you crazy. That is one of those wonderful old nostalgic, I should say, tunes written for Yiddish Broadway called Mein Städtele Bells. And there are dozens of these songs that were put into theater pieces that people think are like, they're so well known or they've been heard so many times, people think they're folk melodies. And of course, no, it was written by Alexander Olshanetsky in 1926 for a Yiddish Broadway show on Second Avenue in New York. And they were typical, there were lots of these because you had homesick people who looked nostalgically back at their old hometowns. And I think that Fiddler on the Roof definitely played to a certain odd nostalgia people have for what the shtetl was, yet most people don't actually know what a shtetl was. I mean, they think of it as maybe a small town, they're not sure, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So nothing in Eastern European Jewish life is more beloved and more maligned than the shtetl. There's a wonderful, weird nostalgia for a place many of us have never seen or only heard of as terrible or wonderful, nothing in between. Our people's memories are either fantastic, oh, it was so wonderful in the shtetl, everyone was so close, or awful, my God, the mud was disgusting. There was no in between for most people's memories. And for my generation, I'm in my 50s, at best, we have grandparents and maybe parents who were born in Europe, maybe. So for my generation, the only image we have is Fiddler on the Roof. And how accurate is Fiddler? And the answer is, no, not particularly accurate from a historical point of view. Wonderful theater. And I recommend highly that you read the Tevye stories in translation, into English translation by Shalom Aleichem, because they are fabulously wonderful stories, a lot more detail. And Tevye is more likable in the books even than he is in the show. So, right. So for those younger than me, like my kids, there are few who can tell them firsthand anymore, even what their life was like in Europe. They can't tell you because there's almost none of them left. Very few folks that are old enough who remember Europe to really tell my children. So, as they say in Yiddish literature, or like they say, the source of all knowledge on Eastern European Jewish life was, for most people, Fiddler on the Roof. This spiked largely due to Israeli and Zionist notions as the shtetl as a filthy, impoverished place of Jewish persecution and by association, Jewish weakness, as in Fiddler on the Roof. Loved because we have nostalgic views of a life that may or may not have ever actually happened like that, where everyone was from, everyone was kosher, everyone got along, it was important, that kind of thing. Tradition was undisturbed, in short, like Fiddler on the Roof. Neither and both were true, as we shall discuss in the course of time. First, we have to define what a shtetl is and what a shtetl is not. A shtetl is not a Jewish neighborhood. We jokingly can call a Jewish neighborhood a shtetl, like for example, between Park Heights and Green Spring, further in town. We can all joke, Black Cat Land over there is definitely sort of, hello.
That's not good. There we go.
We can jokingly call that a shtetl, but of course it is not a shtetl. It's just a Jewish neighborhood. A shtetl is not a village. A village is called a dorf. A shtetl is not a city. A shtot is a city. A shtetl is not a ghetto. The ghetto is a Western European phenomenon from the Middle Ages where Jews were literally walled in and locked up at night, starting in Italy, hence the word is actually Italian, ghetto, G-H-E-T-T-O, ghetto is Italian word, started in Venice and other cities. No, Western European phenomenon, and there was no ghetto in Eastern Europe until the Holocaust. So what is it? A shtetl, by definition, is a town of about 10 to 15,000 people with a regular marketplace that met at least once a week. It's a market town. Even Jews who were native Yiddish speakers who came from Eastern Europe mistook various and sundry communities as shtetls, as sort of a one-size-fits-all word for any sort of Jewish settlement in Europe. Take this example by Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great Jewish philosopher. He said, and I quote, Koritz, Karlin, Wrocław, Lubavitch, Ger, Lublin, hundreds of little towns that were like holy books, in humble wooden synagogues looking as if they deliberately closing themselves off to the world. The Jews purified the souls that God had given them. Even plain men were like artists who knew how to fill the weekday hours with mystic beauty. If that's not nostalgia, I don't know what is. But elevated nostalgia aside, Koritz and Ger, Lubavitch and Wrocław could be described as shtetls because they were fairly small. Lublin, on the other hand, had a population of 100,000. That ain't no shtetl, that's a shtut. Right, that's a city. Karlin is a suburb of the city of Pinsk, what is now Belarus. A Yiddish author, Israel Axenfeld, in the 19th century, defined humorously, I love this description, by the way, the difference between a shtet and a shtetl. Anyone familiar with our Russian Poland knows what our Jews mean by a small shtetl, a little town. A claimed shtetl, a little town, has a few cabins and a fair every other Sunday. There, Jews deal in liquor, in grain, burlap, or tar. Usually there's a man striving to be a Hasidic Rebbe. A shtet, on the other hand, contains several hundred wooden houses and a row of brick shops. There are in a shtet a rich man who is a parvenu, several well-to-do shopkeepers, a few dealers in fields, hairskins, wax, honey, some big-time moneylenders who either use cash belonging to the rich man, going halves on the profits, with the tenant farmers or innkeepers in the surrounding area. Such a town has a Polish landowner who is a nobility or minor nobility who owns all the land and owns the town. He's called in Yiddish a paritz. In Polish, it's called Szlachta. He owns the town and some 10 villages, the entire district being known as a schlissel. Some prominent Jew who is held in esteem at the manor houses leases the entire town and sometimes the entire district. Such a town has a Jewish VIP who's a big shot with the district police chief. Such a town has an intriguer who's always litigating with the Jewish administration of the town, even up to the provincial level. In such a town, the landowner tries to get a Rebbe to take up residence because if Jews come there from all over, you can sell them a whole lot of vodka, ale, and mead. All of these goods, of course, belong to the landowner, and so his income goes up. Such a town has a winehouse keeper, a watchmaker, a doctor, a past cantor and a present cantor, a broker, a madman, an abandoned wife who cannot get her husband to grant her a divorce, community beadles, and a caterer. Such a town has a tailors association and a free loan association, a Talmud association, and of course a burial society. Such a town has various kinds of synagogues, a shul, mainly for Shabbat and festivals, a base medrash for everyday prayers as well as study, and sometimes even a klezel, which is a small place of worship, and even a shtibel for Hasidim. God forbid anyone call a town like this a shtetl. He'd be instantly branded as the local smartass or a madman. He continues, a town is called a big town, a groß Stadt, if there are a couple of thousand householders and a few brick buildings aside from the wood homes. This is a horse of a different color. Here, everyone boasts that he greeted someone from the next street because he mistook him from an out-of-towner. After all, in a town this big, how can you tell if a stranger is local? There are tons of people you don't know from Adam, close quote. Problem number two is that in literature and in popular imagination, there are hardly any non-Jews. And those who do appear are trouble. Almost all of Jewish literature had a non-Jew who, if not in the actual picture, was almost always something of a presence, which of course was the landowner, the Shlachta. This class of people, non-Jewish nobility and gentry, owned the towns, the fields, the forest, and most of the industry in those towns. In literature, and therefore in communal image of the local Shlachta, was either benign, the Count Potocki being an example of that. Potocki was known as being a pretty fair-minded guy, or a sadistic and immoral dissolute who signaled the breakdown of Poland itself under foreign domination. Usually this was Russians. From a historical point of view, the Shlachta considered everyone who wasn't one of them beneath them, and the Jews, of course, were below that. But as we shall learn in the course of time, the Jews were very useful economically, for reasons both positive and negative. The peasants were not described particularly favorably, but most destined for a real lambasting, of course, was the local priest, either Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. Peasants are described as being drunk, stupid, and more than anything else, physically strong brutes. These are images typical you find in Isaac Bashevis Singer, for example. Most Jewish literature from the mid-19th century describes the Tsar as being beneath contempt. No surprise there. Lands under Austrian domination, like Galicia or Bukovina, hardly did any better, although the imperial government in Vienna was ultimately hated less than the one in St. Petersburg. Galician Jewry, somewhat unlike Jews living under Russian domination, had a strong inclination towards science and education. 4 Nobel Prize winners originated from a community in Austrian Galicia, as the Austrian policy of education was entirely different from that of the Russian. Just a few major Galician towns in Poland today are Łańcut, Dąbrowa Tarnowska, where I've sung, Bobowa, which of course where the Bub of Hasidim come from, Rymanów, Lesko, and of course more sizable towns like Nowy Sącz, Sands, Tarnów, Rzeszów, and Przemysł. Hey, 5 points for me to knowing how to pronounce those in Polish. Another source of information, though not exactly known for being accurate, as I just told Wolf before, is something called a Yizkorbuch. The Yizkorbuch is a memorial volume written about a particular community after the Holocaust. Frequently, they are a highly idealized version of what the town was like before the Holocaust, where secular and religious got on just fine, vignettes of the local rebbes and so on, socialists and Zionists, modern women, local boys made good, all that sort of thing. In some of these cases, Yizkorbuch are the only source of information we have about communities. Written by survivors or someone hired by the survivors to write it up. The other descriptions we get of the shtetl, as well as other Eastern European Jewish settlements, come from non-Jews. One from fiction writers and poets, who are almost always Poles, and another either from government officials or Protestant evangelicals coming to make converts, usually without much success, by the way. And finally, travelers who for some reason were passing through and went to Jewish-run inns and taverns or had to board with a Jewish family while en route someplace. There wasn't Motel 6 in those days. They were all basically Jewish taverns, or Jewish-run taverns would be more accurate to say. There were positive things said by important writers about these Jewish spaces. The most famous writer and national poet of Poland, Adam Mickiewicz, wrote nostalgically and almost positively about Jews and created a well-known character that remains thoroughly entrenched in the Polish imagination, and that's Jankiel, the tavern or innkeeper, in the national epic called Cantor. We'll talk about more about booze and Jews later on. It was a big business. Another positive Polish stereotype is found in a famous novel called The Magic Lantern from the 1840s. And it says, do you know what makes every town Polish? The Jews. When there are no more Jews, we enter an alien country and feel, accustomed as we are to their good sense and services, as if something is not quite right. So when did the shtetl begin? By the time shtetls were first written about in the later part of the 18th century, settlements like these were already hundreds of years old. The image of the impoverished shtetl is an appropriately late 19th century or early 20th century description. But if one goes to shtetl, fairly sizable towns now, remember, of 10,000, synagogues were built that were magnificent structures. They may have been falling apart by the 19th century, but they were built centuries earlier and were made to last because they were still standing. And in many towns you go to now, where there's still synagogues, they're still standing. Maybe not great shape, but there are many still standing in Poland even today. So, the 16th century was a time referred to by some scholars as the golden age of shtetl history. One way to tell how old the settlement was and how wealthy it was must be to look at the synagogues. Krakow, for example, has a synagogue that dates to the early Renaissance. The beautiful Renaissance synagogue in Zamość dates to the first decades of the 17th century to a Sephardic community that has been there since at least 1580. Kikotzin, a small town located in the southeast region of Poland, was once the vibrant shtetl of Tiktin, an important center of Talmudic learning and culture. Its earliest masonry synagogue was built in 1642, replacing an earlier wooden structure. It was reconstructed in the 1730s when there was a fire, and rebuilt again in the 18th century in this new form. Today, it is one of the best preserved 18th century synagogues in Poland. Let's look at the settlement of Lubomil. According to the 1564, there were 8 merchants and 26 craftsmen in Lubomil, organized into guilds. These were Jews now. There were 3 functioning Orthodox churches, an Orthodox monastery, and a synagogue. In 1564, the Jewish community paid 150 florins in tax. That's 1 florin per person. Small settlement, 150 people. The Jews worked in crafts, leased land, and traded with Lvov, Lemberg, Lviv now, Kiev, Brest, Przemysl, Lublin, and Warsaw. It's hundreds of miles away. Commodities were transported down the river Bug. Yes, it really does call Bug as the name of the river. To Gdansk, which is Danzig, and other cities. And there were mainly timber, potash, wax, honey, salt, saffron, jewelry, and other commodities. The 1667 Protocols of the Council of the Four Lands, which we'll discuss another time, listed annual tax rates per person. Larger towns are listed separately, but Lubomil, with its 8,100 guilders tax levied on the local Jewish community, meant that it was pretty sizable. After a census in 1847, the Jewish community of Lubomil had 2,100 members. By 1870, Jews already consisted of 2/3 of the town's inhabitants. In 1897, the population was 4,600, 3,300 of which were Jews. Among them, according to the 1898 data, 349 craftsmen, 52 workers, 300 students, 17 teachers, and 60 students studying at the Talmud Torah. The so-called Golden Age, or at least an era of relative prosperity, lasted until the first third of the 19th century. Despite the fiddler on the roof idea that the shtetl was a place that never changed, the Golden Age shtetl was anything but. It was a dynamic place economically, in manufacturing prior to the Industrial Revolution, and especially in trade. For the Polish nobility, the great landowners, the Szlachta, the shtetl was a private town and an economic territory. The Russians, who inherited most of what I would call shtetl land in central Poland and a huge swath of the Ukraine, had a different philosophy and played a different kind of game, as we shall see in future sessions. For the Russians, the Jews became a problem and a question, and ultimately their method led to the decline of the shtetl. By the 20th century, the shtetl was indeed a place of deep poverty. By the time of the Holocaust, it was on the verge of disappearing altogether, as vast numbers of Jews had migrated to urban centers or emigrated abroad. A major part of the economy of Eastern European Jewry was something called leaseholding. Now, when Poland had an enormous land empire, which I'll show you maps in the course of the next couple of classes, Poland was the biggest country in Europe in the 1600s and earlier. It had most of Ukraine almost down to Odessa, almost to the Black Sea, was under control, all the way up to parts of Poland, which is now modern-day Latvia, all the way south, and a considerable amount west, but considerably further east as far as Smolensk. I'll show you a map. It was very big and very wealthy. And you had magnates, those Szlachta, who owned enormous amounts of land. I'm talking like the size of the state of New Jersey or bigger. And they had in various and sundry counties that they owned, whole counties that they owned. They had built a castle, and not a little thing either. I'm talking a pretty considerable house, real big mansion in each of those things. And if and then when the local Szlachta decided to actually be in town, he stayed in his big mansion. But if you think the local Szlachta stayed at home and didn't go to Warsaw to go gambling and party. When someone else did the work, you got something coming to you. So what they did was they wanted cash up front. So what they did was they had the local Jews invited in, which we'll talk about at length sometime later, probably in 2 weeks from now. The Jews are invited in. The Jews then take their excess capital, if they had any, and started investing in not buying businesses, leasing businesses. Well, they put up the cash up front. They leased the farms, they leased the farmlands, they leased the local tavern. This was a very, very, very big part of things, especially once distillation occurred and you had vodka. Then you had really big business, really big business. And terrible reports of Ukrainian peasants so drunk that they puked and fell over drunk on the side of the road and passed out before they even got home. Terrible reports of alcoholism that were brought on in part by these taverns. Anyway, they had this leasing idea as early as the 1600s, and they would lease businesses, as I said. So in 1764, 1765, this is the height of the shtetl time, in what was called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was basically the Polish Empire, but it was combined with the Greater Lithuania. Don't ask, it was all dominated by the Poles anyway, but it was called the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth was huge, as I said. And in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, more than 1/3 of employed Jews were leaseholders of various kinds. Very small businesses, very large businesses. So the importance of leaseholding declined with economic modernization, but continued to be a principal source of income for Jews. And of course, the magnates, the landowners. That's how they made their money. They had the cash up front. They even had something called a tax farmer, which is a very odd thing because there was no farming involved. That meant he collected the tax from the farmers. He was a tax collector. The Jews did that too. They fronted the money that the local nobility thought that they would collect. They would, of course, collect more because they could get more out of people, but the upfront money, it's sort of like those payday loans. It's like that. So granting leases was one of the most central ways for nobility to extract money from land and from monopoly rights. That was another thing. You could lease the land, you could sell cigarettes, you could sell tobacco, you could sell products. You bought a monopoly. You weren't going to have a competitor. You were the only one who sold that. So you got the local monopoly of the local peasantry, the local burghers, and all the Jews. You guaranteed yourself an income. So monopoly rights, I should say, though the two were not always terminologically distinguished, that was a big word. Jews initially entered the practice of leaseholding by way of their traditional involvement in money lending, which made them a central source of cash, which was always in short supply by the medieval agrarian society. Since the upper nobility found it difficult to convert incomes in kind to estates in its estates to cash, the state apparatus for the collection of taxes and customs was also underdeveloped. You're going to find this as a constant theme. The Jews are invited in to stimulate economic development for good reasons and for bad. As you'll see with the inns, as we talk about Jews and booze down the road, it was thought that Jews never got drunk, and ergo wouldn't drink the profits, and therefore were the perfect people to own an inn. If you've ever seen Hasidim drink at a Farbrengen, you know that ain't true. So in other words, they would basically collect from the farmers, not cash, but grain. So they would turn that into cash by brewing it, making vodka, and then selling it back to the very peasantry who had farmed it to begin with. Grain exports dropped drastically once distillation was invented. They had been the primary bread basket, Poland and Lithuania, had been the bread basket for Western Europe for a while. And they shipped huge amounts of barley and wheat and oats and other things, rye. And instead, those kind of dropped because they didn't pay as well, because vodka paid better, paid real better. And you didn't have to schlep it all over the place. So there were two types of leases, the lease of land and the arrenda, the lease of monopoly rights. The Jews entered the practice by way of money lending, as I said, which made them an essential source of cash as well. And And then borrowed money against mortgages and leases and monopoly rights became the most convenient way to get cash for the upper nobility. As early as the 12th century, Jews were prominent in leasing monopoly rights, mainly those of the crown. In salt mining, minting coins was a big thing in Eastern Europe. And if you find coins from like the 12th century, they often have Hebrew on them because they were coined by Jews. They actually manufactured the money. And collecting customs and taxes, which, as I said, is also called tax farming. Leasing rural estates to Jews, an entire estate, was not popular until the mid-17th century, but it was very popular by a wealthy enough Jew or a Jew who had borrowed enough capital. And you owned the land itself and all the monopoly rights to every business, which you could then in turn lease to someone else. Holding such leases gave the Jewish leaseholder de facto status as a nobleman, a situation that led to a lot of tension with the peasant population and may have been one of the causes of the infamous Khmelnytsky pogrom in 1648. We'll talk about that too. It was one of the great, awful uprisings of the Ukrainians. They killed thousands of Jews, they killed thousands of Poles in an uprising against their Polish masters and who they saw as the local representative of the local masters, of course, was us. So why not take out your raids on the Poles and everybody's favorite topic, favorite target, us. Jews displaced peasants and burghers who were also interested. Burghers are like often Germans who were invited in to become craftsmen and develop craft skills. These were people who were sort of townies, like upper ranking town people, usually involved in town government and that kind of thing. But they were displaced by Jews who were interested in competing for leaseholds. In fact, the profitability of leasing became clear in the 16th century, and the majority of inn and tavern keepers had been hereditary peasant leaseholders. In other words, if your father was a leaseholder, you could inherit his lease. So it would pass down for generations that you owned that inn, you owned that timber forest, you owned that salt mine. Well, not owned, you leased that salt mine, and that lease got inherited. So it went down generations, so wealth continued to be developed by some families. And as we'll find out in the course of time, the shtetl was anything but a place of economic equality. It was a very rigid class structure, and you did not marry up unless you were a Torah scholar, in which case then maybe you got to marry a rich girl from a rich family, because that was considered to be very special. If you were a real Talmid Chacham, then they were interested in you. Otherwise, if you were poor, you stayed poor. Unless you found somebody who was a rich relative or an uncle somewhere who was going to sell you a lease. Didn't happen much. So the success of Jews in ousting them was a result of several factors. Jews didn't drink as much, relatively advanced literacy and mathematical knowledge, but above all, their ability to pay in advance and to bear the consistent and constant rise in the cost of leases caused by growing profits and, of course, inflation. Hereditary leaseholders survived to a certain extent on royal and ecclesiastical estates. In other words, the church owned huge tracts of land too. And what would the church do in addition to disliking Jews? They leased the land to Jews because they got money up front. And they practically disappeared on the Magnet estates by the mid-17th century. Jewish leaseholding was so profitable that they were used on the royal and even ecclesiastical estates, as I said, despite prohibitions by the church itself against doing such a thing. And they enjoyed the right to produce alcohol for their own consumption, a factor that would lead to conflicts, as I said. The popularity of this leasehold caused a shift of local populations, not towards the cities, but towards the countryside, where Jews in villages made up almost 40% of the Jewish populations in certain regions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and an even higher proportion outside of the Commonwealth in Bohemia and in Hungary. The process had far-reaching social and even religious implications, as rural Jewish innkeepers tended to live in isolation from the Jewish communities of the market towns, far from the established education systems and communal religious life. Some scholars suggest that the roots of the Hasidic movement lay in the rural shift of the Jewish population. The rural inn or tavern was usually the center of social life in a village. It also served as the local shop, a local place where you could pawn your goods, and among other things. It was also known, especially in literature, that if you wanted advice, you went to the tavern keeper, because the local Jewish tavern keeper was a wise man. You frequently got loans from him, you drank on credit from him, etc. But he also kind of took care of you. It was a weird relationship with the peasantry. I mean, they liked us and they hated us simultaneously. Very strange relationship, as we'll see. Right, leaseholding agreements often included a partial transfer of something called the corvée. In other words, this was still a feudal economy, and in feudal times, when the local feudal land, the serfs belonged to the land. And that meant that the local noblemen who owned the land basically owned the serfs. And you could, besides farming, you could force them to work and do labor for you for free, a certain number of days of the year. So if you owned the lease, you could get your local peasantry to also come and do work for you and pay nothing. This could lead to tension, to say the least, between Jewish leaseholders and local peasants, who of course they saw as the solo representative of the Lord and permanently present in the village. Jewish tavern keepers then became a recognized feature of Polish rural life, as evidenced by their appearance as a popular motif in 19th century Polish literature, as I said, and will be discussed further on. Here's a quote by the Polish chronicle Stefan Gawczyński, who lived from 1690 to 1756. All of the towns, large and small, are filled with nobody but Jews, who also run the village breweries, the roadside taverns, and inns, so that our Poland is more like Jerusalem than a Polish state. And many a traveler would have been tempted to agree. Along the journey on the muddy roads of Poland and Lithuania, relieved only by a stop at a tavern, one could get a drink, feed oneself, feed one's horses, purchase necessities, exchange news. This was prior to CNN and Fox, guys. And finally get some sleep, because they could rent some space, sometimes on the floor, sometimes in the house, wherever they could afford it. Right. And as the nobles who owned the taverns preferred to lease them to Jews, the weary traveler almost always received by an exotic Jewish proprietor. The weight and importance of leaseholding in the occupational structure of Eastern European Jewry decreased in the 19th century. With urbanization, modernization came, and in the second half of the 19th century, Eastern Europe was late in the game of getting into the Industrial Revolution, which happened in the West in the first half of the 19th century. From 1850 on, slowly, Eastern Europe began to develop manufacturing and larger industry. And that led to people leaving villages. They were also thrown out of villages. We'll talk about that in time. And they left the shtetl and they went to bigger cities where they could find work. So Jews had been brought into villages by this leaseholding economy, but it collapsed basically in the middle of the 19th century. And it provided settlement and sources of livelihood, enabling the growth of the Jewish population of Poland, Lithuania, the Commonwealth. And even during its decline, during the tarnishing image in the 18th century, the Orenda system, their system of leaseholding, was for a considerable time played an important role in both Jewish and Polish economic and social life. So in the second half of the 19th century, you had the invention of a different type of Jew called the Luftmensch. You ever heard that expression? There's a guy who lives on air. He's so poor, he has no skills, and he basically lives by begging and tzedakah and picking up an odd job here or there. You had a lot of these in Eastern Europe. In Europe in general, in the 19th century, there was a population explosion due to one tuber. You know what a tuber is? A potato. The potato led to a massive population growth in the 19th century because it was cheap, it could grow anywhere, it had a lot of nutrition. And guess what? If you had a lot of things to eat, you could have more children, which you could feed. And the 19th century saw a giant population increase in Eastern Europe of Jews, of Poles, of Ukrainians, but also Irish. Remember the Irish potato famine failed and hence depopulated Ireland. But you had this massive population boom in Eastern Europe and through Central Europe as well, where the potato had become sort of this thing. And with that and a declining income base in the smaller towns and in the Städtler, you no longer had this lease economy to drive the local economy. You simply didn't have jobs anymore. And those magnificent synagogues kind of fell apart. And so the image of the shtetl as this impoverished, backwards, awful place started to develop in the second half of the 19th century because of economics. And then, of course, in the villages, the Jews were forced to leave by the Russians, who took over, by the way. Why did vodka cease to be a Jewish business in the 19th century in the Russian territories? The Russian government took it over and had a monopoly. That was the end of that. So the whole leasing system of taking over estates and so on basically flopped in time. It lasted 300 years, which is not bad, but all things come to an end. And when that basically fell apart, therefore ended all the economic drive for all these places. And in the second half, the later half of the last third, I would say, of the 19th century, beginning in the 1880s, I guess that's the last quarter, isn't it? Never mind, not important math. But certainly from the 1880s onward, you started to have massive immigration from Eastern Europe going to America and to Western Europe, to England, etc. You had this massive people getting up and leaving because they were poor. They were not so poor that they couldn't afford a steamship ticket. They could still get a ticket on a boat. They could afford that much. But a lot of them left because there was no economy anymore. So while we like to think they were driven out like Anatevka by the local Russians who hated them, there was a pogrom all the time. They were not pogroms all the time. They were pogroms and they were ugly, really ugly. But they were not a regular event like every week. So in other words, that was not a regular feature of Jewish life. It was an irregular feature of Jewish life, and it was an awful figure of Jewish life, and it scared the daylights out of people enough to consider moving. But what really got them to move in huge numbers was financial. They simply couldn't have anything to live on anymore. And so there's all those wonderful Yiddish songs about potatoes, because all they could live on was potatoes. Monday, what do we eat? Potatoes. Tuesday, what do we eat? Potatoes, etc. Shabbos, what do we eat? Potato kugel. That's the song that was around in the 19th, one of those Jewish folk songs. It's complicated, this history. And the relationship between Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians, to say the least, was complicated. To this day, Ukrainians and Poles are not the best of friends. Poles and Lithuanians are most definitely not the best of friends. Jews and everybody else are not the best of friends, although Poles are a little bit different in their attitude about Jews now. Younger Poles, especially educated younger Poles. Kind of a different story than it was for a long time. But Jewish life in Eastern Europe was certainly good enough that they lived there for hundreds of years, developed the economy, lived, I wouldn't say middle class, but certainly not quite as hand to mouth as Tevye did. In Fiddler, he's basically got very little food, despite the fact that he was played by a very fat actor. He was actually in the books described as being skinny as a rail, because he didn't eat particularly well. No one did if they were Luftmensch in Eastern Europe. But it was a really fascinating world, and we'll discuss why on our next session, why Jews wound up in Eastern Europe to begin with, and it wasn't just financial. It was tragic. And when you look at the history of Eastern Europe versus Western Europe, Eastern Europe was almost paradise, because Western Europe was horrendous. Not just in Spain. In Spain, they burned people to death for writing Jews, right? We all know this from the Spanish Inquisition. There was inquisitions all over Europe. And Jews got regularly thrown out from the Middle Ages onward. There were no Jews in England, for example, for almost 300 years, because they were expelled.
They were thrown out in 1205 with the statute of Queen Anne.
Right, they were thrown out. Sometimes they got thrown out and were able to go back. But this is why the Jewish population of Western Europe was so small, why the Jewish population of Eastern Europe was so huge. It was enough of a refuge, and you could make enough of a living that you could stay there for a long period of time. I'll be happy to take questions if I can answer them, I hope. Right, we got plenty of time for questions, so if you have any and I can answer them, I'll be happy to. Michael.
1772.
1772, the first division of Poland, yes.
Christina, the Tsarina of Russia.
Yes.
Inherited 4 million Jews in the Pale.
Yep.
What influence that how we introduction of the caste system.
Okay, so the question was about Catherine the Great and the inheritance of the Jews from the divisions of Poland. So Poland kind of declined as a power from 1648 onward. Up to 1648, it had been this massively powerful state. But the Poles had one problem, and that is kings were elected, and they were elected by the nobility. And one person in the nobility in the Senate, the Polish Senate, which was all nobility, of course, one person could get up and say, no good, and had immediate veto power. So anyone could stand up and say, I disagree with this legislation, and that was the end of it. So the government started to teeter. Economic conditions started to teeter. They were invaded from multiple sides. Did you know the Swedes were actually a world power for about 50 years? True. In fact, they tried to set up a colony where? In Christiana in Delaware. If you drive up I-95, you'll see Christiana. That was of all things, a Swedish settlement. They tried to set up a silk farming business, and of course discovered that it flopped. Hence the end of the Swedes there. But the Swedes invaded Poland and a lot of Eastern Europe, and they tried to, they did enough damage that Poland never really recovered. And as Michael said, in 1772, you had what was called the first partition of Poland. And you had three major empires as their next door neighbors. The Austrians to the southwest, the Russians to the east, and a rising state that began as a little thing, but became very powerful, called Prussia. It started around Berlin, a little area, and slowly but surely became a massive world power. Joke about Prussia was, of course, that they weren't a country with an army, but an army with a country, was frequently the joke. And the three local, these three empires decided, Poland is weak. What are you going to do about it? Eat it. And that's literally what they did. And they sliced up Poland bit by bit, 1772, and then again later, the last division of which being 1796. There was no such thing as Poland anymore. Poland was a geographical expression. Poland had Poles and Jews and Ukrainians and so on, but there was no Poland. There was no Commonwealth. There was no Lithuania. There just was. Believe it or not, the Russians did not own the biggest swath at first. As far as east as Warsaw was actually controlled by the Prussians. And after the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the Russians got the majority share of Poland. So when a lot of people say they're from Russia, they really were from Russian Poland or from area of the Pale of Settlement. Catherine, like most Russian monarchs, was not used to dealing with Jews because Jews were not allowed in the rest of Russia. They were forced to stay in that area where they had already settled. So it wasn't like they had to move. And this was called the Pale of Settlement, which meant that's where you can live. And you had to have a special permission to move to any of the interior cities of Russia. Or also Kiev, by the way. Even though that was actually in that whole area, you needed a special residence permit to live there. Mykolaiv, a couple of other cities, you needed special permission to live there if you were a Jew. By the way, this is why so many Jews became classical musicians, because you could get a permit if you played violin, because you could get a job in an orchestra. And believe it or not, this led to an explosion in Jewish violin playing, so they could get permits. And also, if you were a choir boy, you could take your family to these new choral synagogues that were being formed. And you could sing in the choir of the synagogue and actually make enough of a living to support your family. And they had residence permission to live in a place like Moscow or St. Petersburg or Kiev or Nikolaev or any of these other cities where Jews were not permitted to live. The Tsarina, she wasn't Tsarina, but even though she had the power of a Tsar, Catherine was no longer of the Jews. Maria Theresa, who inherited an enormous number of Jews in the Austrian Empire, was certainly no longer of the Jews. And they taxed them very highly, especially the Austrian Empire had the worst taxes of anybody. They had a candle tax. And if you had Shabbos candles and you didn't pay the tax on them, someone would walk in and put out your Shabbos candles. Which, of course, if you were a religious Jew, you're not relighting your Shabbos candles on Shabbos. So your Shabbos candles were put out by someone. So they were very meat taxed. They were very, very highly taxed in an effort to maybe get them to move. Catherine slowly changed over Polish nobility for Russian nobility. It took a long time. It never really happened. The Russians, because Russia is so huge and incredibly inefficient, were very slow to do anything. And so Jewish life changed very slowly in areas under Russian control at first. Whereas things in Galicia changed more quickly because the Austrians set up two major cities. One was already a major city, and that was Krakow. Although Krakow declined because the city of Lviv, it's now called Lviv in Western Ukraine, they changed the name, called it Lemberg, and made that the provincial capital. And that became a very big city for the Austrians. And so there was a lot of cities in that area that became affected by Lemberg. And so you had a different spread of things going on, something called the Haskalah, which I'll talk about down the road, which you know about, Michael, I'm sure. But Russian Poland never quite in the pale anyway. The Kingdom of Poland, which is a whole other thing I'll talk about, which was Russian Poland, had its own thing, but the Pale of Settlement remained very backward until the Russians actually drove people out of the villages. Because they didn't want the peasants being affected by booze quite so much, unless it was going to be Russian booze. Jewish booze, no good. Russian booze, just fine. So that was okay with them, but that's part of what happened. Everyone looks shell-shocked. Oh my God, I've given them too much information. I'm sorry. All right, now for a word from our sponsor. If you take size 10 hearing aid batteries by Duracell, available for free because someone bought the wrong size and they're available to you if you have hearing aid batteries and you need them in size 10, here they are. So there are no other questions. My God, I answered everything you ever wanted to know. There's a lot more to know. A lot more to know. And I had to spend a long time reading a lot of stuff, and I already knew a lot of stuff, but there was so much information because there's so much scholarship going on in the last 50, 60 years. And especially since the fall of communism, all these records are available now. So whatever survived the Nazis, you can find all this paperwork because it was saved. It all went to archives. And so everything up to the 20th century is actually remarkably well preserved in the archives in Warsaw. The 20th century stuff got bombed when Warsaw was destroyed. 90% of Warsaw was destroyed in the Second World War, at the end of the war, by the German Air Force. Can you imagine that? 90% of a city just flattened. Anyway, so those archives
Is that
existed.
what's happening now with Ukraine?
Yes. Yeah, that is what's happening now with Ukraine. But it's interesting because now we know names of towns in Ukraine we never thought of before because we're watching all this war news that I knew of only because of my own research into this stuff because I was interested.
I'm listening to you and thinking about what's going on here.
Yeah,
And there's so many similarities.
in what way?
We're too comfortable.
As I said in my last sermon, we are very comfortable in America. And it's always loaded when you're Jews getting comfortable because you never know what's going to come down the pike.
And it's not just that. I look
Yeah.
at how my kids look at the news. And they're, 40s, 50s.
Right,
And how we look at the news.
right.
And we're alarmed about something. And it doesn't faze them at all. They can't see how it can ultimately turn around and hurt them.
Right. Well, talking about generational views on news as a Jewish person was the comment in question. I know my kids are much more blasé about certain things and much more, I don't want to say affected because that's not right to say either, but they're much more under the influence of, for example, regarding Israel news. They do not look at it from as a Zionist perspective as their father. That's for sure. The influence and constant barrage that they get is negative on Israel, so they're much more cold on the Israel issue. I don't know, it took some time to bring my son around, but he, it's funny because my ex-wife's father, his grandfather is Israeli. So you think he'd have this greater attachment to Israel. He's been there multiple times to see his family over there with his grandpa. And Jake, my son, has had remarkably feelings about Israel for a long time, very tepid. And I insisted that he kind of, really he needed to think about that differently. We spent a long time talking about this, particularly when we were in Krakow 2 years ago. Because I took, we spent all this time going to the Jewish district of Kazimierz in the south part of the city of Krakow, which is really a beautiful place, very well preserved, synagogues and so on. And I said, these places are empty. And these places are empty because they were all killed, because you're only, what, 30 miles, not even from Auschwitz in Krakow. You can take a car trip. Almost anywhere you can get a car trip and go visit Auschwitz. It's like the thing to do for a day, in Krakow, and not just for Jewish tourists either. I said, take a good look at that and realize this used to be full of us. This whole neighborhood was Jews. And why aren't there Jews anymore? I said, and I took him to meet a survivor friend of mine who was a wonderful guy. He was well into his 80s, but he was very sharp. And he showed him his tattoo from Auschwitz, and talked to him about it at length, and gave him his a book that he had written, for a children's book he had written actually, on losing his brother at Auschwitz. And my son had a very different perspective after that. But kids have a very different perspective because Holocaust is kind of old news for them. Holocaust is more and more distant a memory, the less they think about these things. And as it goes, fades from common memory because we don't have survivors, we have very few survivors, fewer and fewer survivors who actually, know and saw these things firsthand. The more it takes on sort of a myth as opposed to what had really happened. Do you know what I mean? Like it fades from memory, it kind of becomes a little, is it really that bad? I mean, do we remember exactly as it was?
It's hard to relate to.
Yeah, I know.
The news, the way it's presented doesn't help.
No, it does not, the way it's presented help. But I think, we are so comfortable in America that the idea that we could become uncomfortable someplace is so foreign to people. Polish Jews in 1939 had a real rough time before the Germans showed up. It was a very ugly time in Polish history, very ugly time.
German Jews thought it wouldn't happen to them.
No one thought that was going to happen in 1939. No one thought that was going to happen. I mean, maybe they thought, this was going to be really awful. I don't think anybody realized the scope of what would happen. Some people say I'm overly cautious, but I always keep my eyeball on the news and watch just what's going to happen with that. But as the lesson of the shtetl, and this lesson I tried to teach you today, we were remarkably comfortable for a very long time in Eastern Europe. And yes, there was violence and there were pogroms and things happened. Yes, even in the golden age of the shtetl, there were problems. But when you're comfortable and you're well off financially and things are good, you don't think about that quite as much. You see that as an aberration, not as a common theme. Someone's phone is beeping. Thank you, Trudy. That's all right. I was wondering if it was a call for me. I have someone said, can I see this transcript? Well, I can certainly give you my lecture notes if you want copies of those. Which I wrote out. All right, are there any other questions or comments? I'll be happy to take them from the floor. I'll be happy to take any from Zoom.
Very, very good.
Yes, ma'am.
Very informative, very
Thank
good.
you.
Very good.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
I agree with Mark, and I say that, and you look at the news, and my husband and myself, and we look at the news, my daughter, her husband, totally different.
It's like I'm seeing the same thing.
Right, exactly.
Well, I mean, I was flabbergasted that until 1965, there were still restrictions on where Jews could live. And it was open. You saw in the newspaper, no Jews,
You saw signs on
There were
every
signs in
club.
neighborhoods all over.
no Negroes, no Jews, no dogs. It was not an uncommon sign.
No, it was no dogs.
Right.
No
No Jews or dogs.
No tanneries, no-
When we moved to Baltimore,
Yeah,
realtors would not show us a house in Guilford.
Mhm,
right,
Only.
absolutely.
right. And steering, yeah, and clubs and things like that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I didn't know about that because I grew up in the 70s and 80s where it was already pretty comfortable. That didn't happen so much anymore.
There was a Supreme Court case, Euclid versus the United States.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, Euclid versus, I don't know what, that got rid of restrictive covenants.
Right.
in the state.
Yeah, restrictive covenants and,
Kids in Mansfield.
or, you know, signs on hotels and public accommodations that said select clientele only. The select being, of course, non-Jews.
Right.
And certainly no one of color, that's for sure. That's for sure. No Jews, no tanneries, no black folk. That's for sure. So, but as we see, and as I think we'll continue to see, Jews did not live in isolation in Eastern Europe, or live in general in isolation in Europe. There are a lot of people say the Jews stuck, who are of the opinion that we never really dealt with non-Jews. The answer is we dealt with them constantly. There was constant interchange between Jews and non-Jews, and cultures affect one another. So if you ask Poles about bread, they'll show you this braided thing that they even refer to as challah. They eat something like, just like what we eat, egg bread called challah. They also eat egg bread like that. They have the same recipes for chicken soup that my grandmother had. I mean, it's remarkable. There's so many similarities, I mean, for all the differences. There's so many similarities between cuisines, for example, and other things like that. So we'll talk about that more. And next time, we're going to talk about how the Jews wound up in Eastern Europe to begin with, and the tragedy of Western Europe, which will be remarkably depressing. So bring some chocolate or something to give you a smile, because it's not happy the next class, and then things will get happier from there.
I have a question.
Yes, Fred.
You mentioned the people from, the Swiss, okay, the basis of the Swiss guards at
Yeah.
in the Catholic Church. Is that because of the expansion back in that period of time, or no?
The Swiss Guard.
Right.
I have no idea. I don't know. Vatican history ain't my thing. So. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining me. Are there any questions on Zoom? Anyone has any comments, questions? I'd be happy to take them. Of course, feel free to email me any questions you have. And if you want a copy of the lecture notes, feel free to ask for those. I'll be happy to send them to you. Next week, you will have maps. Next week, sorry, 2 weeks' time, you'll have maps showing you the flow of Jewish migration and so on. Thank you very much.
Was approximately 25 kilometers.
Anyone know how to turn this microphone off?
Just unplug it.
Oh.
And
Does anyone need size 10 batteries?
I'll find something.
I tried.
Thank you. My grandparents left there. Right about 1902. And the story there was that they actually get my grandfather had already done time with the Russian army. And because of that, he will be here. And then proceeded to, once he got the proper time to take here, he sent all the papers back to the younger brother. So they came in the United States with the same name. And then came here and had his name changed.
My great grandfather on the X side came here in 1837. So all
Yeah.
and so all my great grandparents were all born.
We were really angry.
Yeah.
Wow.
But we're documented in this book of one of the
This is a
52
Civil War.
earliest founders.
I still have a remembrance book from my father's people.
So you're saying that the Yisker book started out as a down history.
I have my very.
Yeah.
When I was very young, my mom was a real estate lawyer.
Right.
She worked for a man named Goldsecker.
Well, Goldfinger, my mom.
Here in Baltimore.
She,
Goldfinger Foundation.
Yes.
yeah, well, that's their way of buying them back,
I used to do some.
buying their way. Anyway, that's what my mom used to say.
Lots of people do that.
Two ways of looking at it. He owned, he bought thousands and thousands and thousands of houses in Baltimore.
Right.
And he would rent them out to blacks, immigrants, whatever.
Right.
I used to go down to my mom's office. They would come in once a week to pay their rent.
Right.
And over the counter, you know, somebody would sign their book, or if they were renters. Then what he did was he would convert them into home buyers. And that's my mom wrote the contracts for the sale. So, they were buying the house the same way that they were renting.
By offering to put a bathroom in the house.
And then he would take a second mortgage, and then if they didn't pay, he got the house back. But the kicker, I mean, that was okay. The kicker was that he hired a lot of salesmen. You know, there's a nigger machine down the street.
And that's exactly
And
what he
that's
used to do.
Yeah.
how he would buy
And
more
he
houses.
created the urgency to move. You know, we're talking about this tragedy that just happened in Evanston Village.
Right.
And Evanston Village was the very first planned shopping center.
The original part.
Right, and then it became for many years by Harry Weinberg. That's what it was.
Wasn't it one?
Yeah.
Weinberg. I did a lot of work in there with the years.
Parties and Weinberg still alive together.
I hated going over to see what had happened to it.
Yeah.
This used to be.
Yeah, when we moved to Baltimore.
But they just had, the kids
Just had
that
shot
took off.
5
went
kids
to
for
lunch,
shooting.
kids just got shot. That was last past week,
Check it out.
The whole story,
We
also
still would go
that whole
shopping.
story.
Yeah.
That was part of
You're right. I actually.
Ah.
That was.
Let me make sure I turn this off.
Everything was true. Basically, that whole story in Hairspray is true. And,
All right, turn this off.
My daughter was the first. Right, it was not, that was the first, actually, I think